Welcome to 4 Plans for Reconstruction, a study guide. In this video, we will be talking about different Reconstruction plans for rebuilding the South at the end of the Civil War. The Civil War devastated the South physically and economically, and it needed to be rebuilt. The period of rebuilding was called Reconstruction. In 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, before the war was even over, Abraham Lincoln issued the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, in which he outlined his plan to help rebuild the South and bring the Southern states back into the Union. He wanted to do this quickly and easily. Before rejoining the Union, his plan required that 10% of the voters in each Southern state take an oath declaring their loyalty to the Union and the Constitution. They had to free all slaves, the Confederate government had to be disbanded or removed, and new governments for each Southern state had to be formed, and no former leaders or high-ranking officers from the Confederacy could be part of that new government. Lincoln then offered amnesty or a pardon to all white Southerners who gave loyalty to the Union, except Confederate military and government leaders. In 1864, 3 Southern states set up governments under Lincoln's plan: Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Radical Republicans convinced Congress to create their own, much harsher Reconstruction plan. Congress passed the Wade-Davis Bill in July of 1864, which required strict voting and election laws for states that were trying to rejoin the Union. According to their plan, a majority of white males in the state had to swear their loyalty to the Union. Only white males who had not fought in the Civil War could vote for any delegates to Congress. Former Confederates were barred or blocked from public office, and any new state constitution had to end slavery. Lincoln, however, did not approve of this plan, so he used his pocket veto to stop the bill from becoming a law. But it did show him that he would have to find some way to find a compromise with the Radical Republicans if they were going to be able to accomplish what they wanted. By fall of 1865, many Southern states created new state governments and elected new representatives to Congress. However, some of those representatives were former Confederate officials, which violated Lincoln's 10% plan. When these representatives got to Washington, D.C., Congress refused to seat them. In March of 1865, a new government agency was set up to help freedmen or former slaves. This agency was called the Freedmen's Bureau. The agency distributed food and clothing, provided medical services, set up schools staffed by Northern teachers like Charlotte Grimke. They gave aid to African American colleges such as Atlanta, Howard, and Fisk universities, helped people acquire land or find work for fair wages. The agency also redistributed confiscated Southern lands to the freedmen who swore loyalty to the Union. Their motto was 40 acres and a mule. Not that everybody got a mule. The land that they were giving to the freedmen was land that the Union soldiers had taken away from Southerners during the war. The Bureau's main goal was to help African Americans, but it also helped pro-Union Southerners. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after the Confederate Army surrendered, President and Mrs. Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth, a pro-Confederate actor, snuck into the Lincoln's box and shot the president in the head during the performance. He then jumped from the box onto the stage and ran away. President Lincoln was taken to a boarding house across from the theater. He died a few hours later with his wife by his side. Lincoln's body was held in state for visitors to come and grieve before his burial. Booth rode on horseback to Virginia, where Union forces found him and several of his co-conspirators in a barn. There was a shootout, and afterwards the soldiers found Booth dead in the barn. Most, but not all, of Booth's co-conspirators were tried and hanged. Lincoln's Democratic Vice President, Andrew Johnson, became the new President of the United States. Andrew Johnson quickly announced his presidential Reconstruction plan in May of 1865. Knowing he would face opposition by the Republican-controlled Congress, he waited until Congress left for recess before announcing his plan. Under his Reconstruction plan, most Southerners would be granted amnesty once they swore loyalty to the Union. 50% of the citizens in each state had to take an oath of loyalty to the Union. High-ranking and wealthy Confederates would be pardoned after appealing directly to the President. Only pardoned whites could vote for state delegates to constitutional conventions. Before entering the Union, states had to denounce secession, agree it was wrong, and states had to ratify or approve the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865. The amendment abolished slavery in all the United States. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. By the end of 1865, most Southern states except Texas were ready to rejoin the Union under Johnson's plan, and Johnson then declared that Reconstruction was over. Unfortunately, he did all this without congressional approval. In addition to his Reconstruction plan, Johnson, never a supporter of the Freedmen's Bureau, undermined its power by making it return all that confiscated land to the South. That meant there was no land to give to the freedmen. In retaliation for Johnson's actions, Congress voted to give the Freedmen's Bureau the power to try individuals charged with violating the rights of African Americans, taking that power from the Southern courts. Congress also voted to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This guaranteed citizenship to all Americans except, kind of ironically since they were here first, Native Americans. It also gave freedmen the right to own property, sue and testify in court, and sign legal contracts. But President Johnson chose to veto both of those bills, saying that the federal government was going beyond its authority. But Congress had enough votes to override both of Johnson's vetoes, and the bills did become law. Despite all of this, the treatment of African Americans in the South was not improving. In response to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, many Southern states passed black codes, or laws, that were made solely to control the freedmen and women and keep them from exercising their new freedoms. Under the black codes, freedmen could not serve on juries, vote, rent or lease land, carry firearms without a license, which they had trouble getting, and if they were found to be vagrants, drunkards, or beggars, they received a very stiff fine. If they were not able to pay those fines, they were sentenced to serve on hard labor chain gangs in the prisons. Those who were working had to enter into annual labor contracts, guaranteeing that they would provide a certain amount of crops every year, and if they didn't, then they were fined or imprisoned, and often lost their jobs. The Black Codes led Congress to pass the 14th Amendment in 1866, but it was not adopted until 1868. The amendment gave full citizenship to anyone born in the United States. Therefore, African Americans became full citizens. Congress demanded that the Southern states ratify or approve the 14th Amendment before they could join the Union. In the election of 1866, President Johnson campaigned against the 14th Amendment and its Republican supporters. But the radical Republicans won overwhelming victories, thereby ending presidential Reconstruction. And the Republicans took charge of Reconstruction, and Johnson could not stop them. This period is known as Radical Reconstruction. In March of 1867, Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act. It called for the creation of new governments in the Southern states that had not ratified the 14th Amendment. These states were divided into military districts and put under Union martial law until the new governments were formed. Under the Reconstruction Act, states had to submit redrafted constitutions, ratify the 14th Amendment, and provide suffrage, the right to vote, to African Americans in order to rejoin the Union. Many white Southerners refused to take part in the elections for constitutional conventions and state governments. The Second Reconstruction Act put Union troops in charge of voter registration in the South to make sure that African Americans were allowed to register and vote. And there you have some of the highlights of Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War.